Good evening and welcome to everyone online. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name's Ian Blatchford and I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at Staffordshire University and a member of the executive team. I will shortly introduce to you our panel of speakers, but before I do that, can I just clarify the housekeeping arrangements for this evening? We will have 3 presentations followed by about 20 minutes for questions. Please post your questions or comments in the chat box. We will ask these in the order that they come through. This session is being recorded and will be available to watch again, and will circulate the details after the event. I'm delighted to be asked to facilitate this conversation entitled Black History Month, Back to the Future, 20 Years Back, 20 Years Forward. And I extend a warm welcome to our panel, who are all colleagues here at Staffordshire University. So I'd like to welcome Harjinder Kaur.
Hello.
Tyrone Messiah.
Hi, everyone.
And Dawn Lawrence.
Good evening.
Race inclusion and the impacts of racism have always been an important part of the higher education discussion. And here at Staffordshire University, we're absolutely no different. However, the impact of the homicide of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, together with our own analysis of how people of colour, staff and students are impacted by discrimination, inequality and racism, has given this additional impetus to our work. We want and expect improvement in the experiences and outcomes of our BAME staff and students. We are implementing our Race Equality Charter Action Plan, and this provides a helpful framework, but there is more we need to do, especially around culture, because this has such a direct impact on individuals and their opportunities to achieve their potential. Tonight's conversation is the first of many, where we will focus on different aspects of race equality, helping us to translate commitment into real action and positive impacts. I'm really looking forward to hearing from our speakers and then having a great discussion on some of the key areas for action. All of our speakers have a deep personal understanding and commitment to race inclusion, and together they will share some of the recent UK history and context for race discrimination, reflecting on how far we have progressed and how much work remains. Our first speaker is Harjinder. Harj recently joined the university and is the course lead for mental health nursing in our School of Health and Social Care. Harj has a background in community development within the Race Equality Council and extensive experience of working with South Asian communities. Her PhD area of study is domestic violence and abuse in the Sikh community. In this first session, Harj will take us back, providing some of the recent UK history and the policy context around race discrimination, taking us from the murder of Stephen Lawrence in 1993 up to the homicide of George Floyd in America this summer, which resonated around the world and led to even more urgent calls for an end to racial discrimination. I'll hand over to Harj.
Thank you, Ian. Welcome, everybody. It's lovely to have you here today, joining us on Back to the Future, 20 years back, 20 years forward. We're going to provide a background and context for the discussion that's due to take place. Unfortunately, my colleague Sarah Page could not be here with us today. She's off sick, but I just wanted to acknowledge her contributions, really. So, Black History Month, we want to sort of just introduce the Stephen Lawrence Day Foundation, which has been launched today as part of, yesterday actually, as part of Black History Month. The idea being that we celebrate the successes of and the achievements that we've made since Stephen Lawrence's murder. And this charity foundation was set up by Doreen Lawrence, mother of Stephen Lawrence. And she says, when Black History Month was first celebrated in the UK, my son was 13 and dreamed of becoming an architect. 5.5 years later, sorry, bear with me, he was dead, murdered in a racist attack just as his life as an adult was beginning. What do you remember about being 18? What a great time it is, but Stephen never got to experience that, nor to fulfill his potential. So why is Stephen Lawrence so important? Why is his legacy important considering race equality? Black teenager Stephen was stabbed to death by a gang of white youths at a bus stop in London. Between 1993 and 2012, the Criminal Justice Service and private prosecutions failed. During this time, lots of evidence was lost, police investigations failed, and no one was brought to trial. Lots of complaints were put to Police Complaints Authority. However, there was no racist conduct in the investigation, simply omissions. Further inquiry by Independent Police Complaints Authority denied racial misconduct, although admitted that there were failings. The family continued to complain. Doreen and Neville continued to complain for the murder of their son, and eventually in 2007, Home Secretary Jack Straw appointed William MacPherson to investigate the killing and police handling of the investigation. Following this, in 2012, there was an eventual prosecution all those years later, and only 2 of the youths were eventually convicted. As a result of this, we have the MacPherson report, referred to as a Lawrence inquiry. This took place and there were 69 days of public hearings, 88 witnesses were questioned, and as a result we got 70 recommendations aimed at improving police attitudes to racism. The report finally identified institutional racism as a reason to the failed investigations. And in addition, that institutional racism exists in other institutions, not just the police. So just to define institutional racism as in accordance to the MacPherson report, the collective failure of an organisation to provide appropriate and professional service to people because of colour, culture, ethnic origin, to be seen or detected in processes, attitudes and behaviour which amount to discrimination through unwitting prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness and racial stereotyping. As a result of the MacPherson report, the Race Relations Amendment Act 1976 was strengthened. This act prevented discrimination on the grounds of in employment, provision of goods and services, education and public function. As a result of the Amendment Act, it was prohibited any direct and indirect discrimination by all public authorities, imposing a statutory public duty. Thereafter, in 2010, after a lot of debate, a single Equality Act was produced. This amalgamated the Disability Act, Race Relations Act, Sex Discrimination Act, and there were strengths and weaknesses to why that happened. Key 9 characteristics were identified within this single Equality Act, which was age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage or civil partnerships, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion or belief, sex and sexual orientation. As a result of this Equality Act, organisations were directed to produce equality impact assessments for their functions. So public authorities had to screen any policies and procedures to ensure that they weren't breaching any of these or disadvantaging any of these characteristics through their everyday practice. On the back of the Equality Act being introduced, there was almost a dilution of race, it is argued. Race equality councils that were present to advocate for BAME staff, community organisations that were formed in the 80s and 90s started being liquidised. Across the UK, they were closed down 2007 onwards, and many BAME activists opposed this move, fearing dilution of race issues. In 2006, the Commission of Race Equality who often oversaw the Race Equality Councils, were replaced by the Equality and Human Rights Commission, embracing the Equality Act and all aspects of equality as part of this legislation. We often debate structural racism versus unconscious bias. So just to be clear, then, structural racism is things that happen within organisations, the system. Systemic racism within the function of organisations, and unconscious bias, and a lot of the training that follows is about altering individual perceptions and beliefs. We advocate the structural racism is more problematic, really, rather than trying to tackle individual, and both are needed, but there is structural racism because it's evident within various discrimination. So COVID-related deaths, the Lawrence report that only came out a few days ago, again by mother of Stephen Lawrence, talks about COVID deaths being disproportionately affecting BAME communities. And this has a huge implication in terms of health inequality within the UK. The European Human Rights Commission equally funded a report in 2018, Is Britain Fairer? There were some improvements noted around employment. However, since COVID, those seem to have returned and were returning just before COVID as well. So there's more unemployment within BAME communities. Black people and young people are particularly affected within this report. We turn to the Lamy review in 2017. This identified disproportionate overrepresentation of BAME in the criminal justice service, that's within prisons, and reference to other areas are made: deaths in custody, stop and search within the police force. In terms of poverty, BAME individuals are twice as likely to live in poverty, according to the Social Metrics Commission, produced this year. So according to the Office of National Statistics, unemployment in the UK is disproportionately represented within black communities. 3% with white ethnicity, 8% black, Bengali, Pakistani. That's quite a difference. In fact, the Resolutions Foundation identified that the BAME experience job losses post furlong as well. So that the situation has got worse since COVID, and that's just a graph that illustrates the extent of the difference between ethnic minorities and white. You may have heard of the Windrush report in relation to education in schools. There was an aim to try and address history within schooling, to introduce more black history, black British history. That's being done in quite an ad hoc fashion, but there was an attempt to do that at one point. Turning to schools, and Sarah Page, who is my colleague and hasn't been able to present her research today, although I have listed it at the end. She did some research in the Midlands, looking at 57 pupils aged between 14 and 17, half of whom were BAME. She found that race hate crime was prevalent, including physical assault with weapons, so some quite serious incidents that are going on in our schools for 14 to 17-year-olds. Islamophobia was very evident within this group, including removal of headscarves. And there's underlying far-right ideologies that were present within this age group. Although there was victimisation with white students as well, this was more apparent in BAME students. In fact, it was found that teachers favoured white pupils. Turning to education in higher education, there is a 13% attainment gap between black and white students at the point of entry to higher education, according to the Closing the Gap report. Black academics in senior positions have dropped to 0 to 2 people in 2018 and 19 compared to previous years. And that's in senior positions, so there's an underrepresentation of Black academics in higher management. And Advanced HE finds that higher education needs to do a lot to achieve long-term institutional change. That's happening, but this is quite recent research stating that there's still a long way to go. We need to avoid deficit models aimed at changing the individual, so that unconscious bias training, looking at microaggressions, although it's important, it's looking at the structural issues and looking at the statistics and looking at underachievement within these organisations, and of course the experiences of BAME staff. It's positive that BAME networks have emerged across higher education establishments where staff and student experiences can be learnt from and shared. It's positive that we are now working towards a decolonisation agenda and widening participation too. And it's really powerful, as Ian was saying, that we are, working towards race equality charter applications and trying to achieve awards and have strict goals and ambitions in terms of furthering race equality within the higher education sector. So 20 years forward, despite all these changes, despite all these initiatives, changes to legislation, policy, how far have we got? So with George Floyd homicide, despite there being video footage of a homicide on the 25th of May, of him being killed by a white officer, he was criminalised, scapegoated. Now, whilst this happened in USA, it is, although the context is important, it's not dissimilar to, they don't have dissimilar experiences in terms of race. This homicide triggered repressed anger about racism worldwide. So it wasn't just UK, lots of other countries. There was protests, there was a lot of anger. It goes back to structural racism. That is the common denominator in both cases of suicide that we've looked at in this short period. Of course, there's many others. It goes back to the deep embedded history of slavery and colonialism and what's been triggered in these people that are protesting and angry about what's happened. So really, how far have we come to resolve institutional racism since Stephen Lawrence's murder? We talk about Black Lives Matter, and this statement's often used. I can't breathe. Versus large movement of all lives matter. So we leave that for discussion, but food for thought. And this is just something in terms of evaluating all lives matter versus Black Lives Matter. Just some food for thought. If a house on your street was on fire, would you expect the fire to arrive and train their fire brigade to arrive and train their hoses on all the houses? Of course not. While they would rightly argue that all homes matter, in that very moment, they'll focus their attention and expertise on the house that's burning down. And so it is with Black Lives Matter. And there's just some research from Sarah, who wasn't able to be here and discuss this in detail, but I've just listed it there if any of you want to access that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Harj. This trajectory of race inequality really helps us to actually understand how past events have shaped, and I think continue to shape, our thinking as well as our policy and practice in the education sector and as Harj mentioned, particularly the HE sector. The research by Sarah clearly demonstrates that despite numerous reports and calls to action, racially motivated discrimination sadly continues. In all our conversations about race equality, we know it's really important that we hear about the experience of people of colour now, as well as those historically, so that we fully understand the personal impacts of racial inequality. So I'm therefore delighted that our next speakers will be sharing some of their experiences, illustrating the sustained impact of race inequality and also reflecting on their hopes for the next 20 years. Our second speaker is Tyrone. Tyrone leads our technical services team here at the university and plays an active role in the inclusion group and the BAME staff network, working over the past year to improve awareness of discrimination through our work done on the Race Equality Charter Mark. His doctoral research unpacks and explores key tensions relating to the engagement of technicians in teaching and learning, and in particular, the development of their location within a community of practice. Tyrone will share his experience as a first-generation descendant of Windrush, growing up in London, and in particular, how his experience of education shaped his understanding of Black history and his position within that narrative, and his reflections on what needs to be done. Thank you, Tyrone, and over to you.
Thank you for that introduction, Ian, and thank you to Haj and Sarah for such poignant words. It was quite a powerful presentation. And before I start, thanks must go out for the huge amounts done by other colleagues across the university and the Staffordshire University Bay network. I also have a special thank you to Geeta Lau, who was our key contact in the student union last year. Her work in particular was instrumental in getting the Staffordshire University Bay network off the ground. So thank you to those contributors. So good evening to our viewers. I hope you're well, and thank you for taking the time to connect this evening. I know that there's a lot going on out there in the world, and we must remain focused on the topic of Black Lives Matter, despite all of the other considerations. I would like to share with you some of my own personal experiences as a first-generation descendant of the Windrush generation, growing up in London in the mid-1970s. That's giving my age away there. My father passed away a year before the Windrush scandal came to light. He was one of the thousands of Caribbean people that came to Britain during the 1950s on an open invitation, ready to serve empire, full of hope and expectation, on the promise of good jobs, healthcare, housing, and education. And I'll come back to the part about education in a moment. But first, I want to acknowledge the people of the Windrush generation and their children, because it's important to understand what the failures in our educational, political, and social systems actually look like, and to see how legislation and policy have worked together to actively exclude. The hostile environment that ensued ended up destroying the lives of many hardworking, loyal, Black and minority ethnic British people. The impact and the legacy of that is clear to see in our society today. However, this evening, I wanted to share a story about how the education system failed me. If you can picture a classroom setting in the 1970s, I can remember we were all sat in a circle and the teacher invited us to share stories about our cultures and where our parents came from. All sounds encouragingly positive, right? Well, as an inner city school at that time, or even at that time, our class was very diverse. I remember proudly telling the rest of the class my father came from a small island in the West Indies. And I remember another child asking me if that was a country in Africa, which, as an 8 or 9-year-old in the 1970s, might be considered a genuinely innocent and valid question. But it was my own response that I now look back on as being shockingly pitiful. I told the class with a degree of authority that Black people came or originated from both Africa and the West Indies. That was my reality. That was my ontological position. That was how I believed things to be. Why? Because I didn't know. I didn't know my own history. At 8 or 9, I knew nothing about the transatlantic slave trade, little about Britain's colonial past, or the legacies it left behind, other than the problematic perspectives and viewpoints developed from films such as Lawrence of Arabia, Gunga Din, and of course Zulu. My teacher never corrected me, never contextualized, never in the moment, nor in the months or years to follow. The only history I knew was of that of white Eurocentric history of British kings and queens, the Tudors, the Stuarts, the Romans, the Saxons, the Normans, conquest, empire, and defenders of the faith, all conveniently illustrated and storified in a series of Ladybird books, which I read diligently. There was never any teaching of Black history or contributions to empire by peoples of colour, or celebration of Black achievement at any stage of primary or secondary education in any subject. As far as I'm aware, in 2020, we haven't progressed very far. But there's some encouraging work being done through the work of campaigners such as Lavinia Stennett, who founded the Black Curriculum Group, leading the way in mounting pressure on the government to provide mandatory teaching of Black history to all pupils in England. During my school years, I was conditioned to accept the messages and images of what superiority, leaders, and power looked like. And it wasn't anything that looked like me or my father. And like many households of my Black friends, their parents reinforced those messages of being inferior, promoted feelings of worthlessness, and that whiteness or the lightness of skin was to be celebrated as the epitome of success. My father didn't teach me our history either. For me, that awakening came much later on. He was a product of a system that had etched its values, measurements, and images of success deep into his DNA, and the effects played out in our home in any number of ways. Indeed, when I tested his knowledge about Africa, his response echoed the stereotypical narrative of unsustainable, unstable regimes, corruption, and poverty. I realize now this is what structural racism does to a person. It doesn't just allow untruths and aggressions to go by, uncorrected or unchallenged. It inhibits success and progression by normalizing stereotypical attitudes and negative imagery. And by downplaying positive achievements, it eventually kills ambition and worth. In my case, this started in the home, reinforced through the school system, and continues as in every part of everyday life in the form of stop and search, profiling and increased checks at airports, shadowed around supermarkets, and now in attitudes and behaviours as a result of disproportionate effects of COVID-19 on the BAME community, all normalised and accepted. Harge already referenced the recent report by Baroness Doreen Lawrence, eloquently pointing out how the current pandemic thrived on structural inequalities within government, health, employment, and the education system. These are the same systemic failures. There's a lot of discourse emerging around decolonising education, but this needs to begin with decolonising our thinking. And at the core of this is the need for us all to begin understanding our collective colonial past and how we fit into that. This is why there can be no getting over it until there is genuine acknowledgement that this isn't just Black history, it's our history, and the understanding and sets of parallels for that which remains, however uncomfortable that might sit. Fast forward 20 years, I now work in higher education and have the opportunity to help address these challenges from the inside. And many would consider higher education to be standout exemplars of inclusivity and diversity. But if we look at the statistics coming out of the Equality Challenge unit, it would suggest we have some way to go. And I think Harge alluded to that in her talk. And that's why the work that we're doing for the Race Equality Charter is hugely important. We are taking huge steps forward towards being more self-aware as an institution, because it's forcing us to hold a mirror up to ourselves and reflect on what we see. Certainly for me, one of the takeaways during the Race Equality Charter exercise has been the need to be critically reflective, and that means continually asking ourselves if our interventions are not only effective at addressing discrimination, but knowing what it looks like and where to look for it. When I first agreed to become part of the University Inclusion Group, my biggest worry was leaping into implementing measures in the time on a tradition of mandatory training, followed by working groups and surveys. Thankfully, we've avoided the simplistic and the mechanistic approach to what are complex issues. Not least because we've understood that ticking boxes does not provide any insight into the lived experiences of subjects such as privilege and white fragility. We've also understood that chasing race equality, charter marks and badges alone will not bring about change and equality. It can't, it's just a framework. But it will help everyone at our university and beyond to understand the issues and be bold enough to stand up and challenge racism in all its forms. And finally, we must also make that pledge to improve representation, progression and success of our minority ethnic staff and students. And schools and universities in particular have a moral obligation in taking a more proactive role in this transformation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Tyrone. I was really struck by your comments there about the impacts of racism on your father and how this played out in your own experiences. And this may be something that we come back to in our discussion. How do we ensure future generations from all backgrounds understand their own history and context? I was also struck by your comments surrounding the holding a mirror up to higher education today. And I'm sure that will be something else that resonates through the questions in the session later on. I'd now like to welcome our third and final speaker, Dawn Lawrence. Dawn is a lecturer and an inclusion lead in our School of Health and Social Care. She is also the acting chair for her school BAME task group. Dawn is a member of the BAME staff network and undertakes a wide range of activities to raise awareness by sharing good practice and ensuring the School of Health and Social Care is a strong contributor to the university's Race Equality Charter Mark work. Dawn's current research focus is on developing a training programme to explore the effectiveness of unconscious bias training, with a primary focus on consciousness and progressive forward thinking to ensure sustained awareness and impact. Dawn will share some of her previous employment experiences as a Black woman, describing not only the challenges she's faced, but also the positive actions she is taking, as she describes it, change the narrative. So thank you very much, Dawn, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I too would like to thank everybody that has spoken before me and everybody involved. I'd like to thank everybody for the staff, the BAME network that has now been formed, and that was by Guy Talal, who I have become very good friends with. I'd like to start with employment, but before I start, I'd like to say thank you to Tyrone, who talked, I think, very eloquently about education, and I can say a lot of what he says resonates with myself because his experiences were the same for me and my parents. In terms of an employment, it was really important for me to want to speak about that because of the incidences that I faced, and I could have let them stop me from chasing what I would say my desired dreams, my goals to progress forward, which I didn't let happen. But at the same time, I have to go back to my parents. It was my parents, like the same when they came to this country, and it was their work ethic that made me realise the importance and the value of working and the value of education too. When my parents came here, just to give some context, my dad ended up in the steel industry, although his goals when he came here was to be either a mathematician or a scientist, because that's the level he was at. But obviously those opportunities were not available for him, and the only thing available were the jobs at that time the community wanted him to do, not what he felt he could do. And that was the nature of the time back in the 60s when he arrived here, unfortunately. My mum was a telephone networker, you know, the lady that was on the phone that would do that and pass you through, and that's what my mum did. So just give you a context. Now, one of the things I want to say before I talk about employment is my dad worked in the steel industry for maybe really nearly 50 years. And in that time, there were occasions when he became redundant. And ironically, although he was eligible for whatever the benefit system was at that time, he refused to take it. We were eligible on occasions for school meals. He refused to take it because he didn't feel like he came here to work and didn't at that time recognise that the state, he could access the state, and he knew he could, but there was something in him that said, no, you go to work and you don't, you know, the system. And that was his view and his attitudes at that time. And I think that's where I'm, you know, in that respect, I'm very proud to say, I think that's where my work ethic came from, as I've been fortunate to have always worked. And there's only been a couple of weeks in between jobs where there's something where that hasn't been the case. Now, in regards to myself and my personal journey through the employment sector, I just wanted to particularly highlight two quick incidences before I move on. The first one was when I was a youth worker, because that's my background, extensive work with working with young people, children and families. And I remember being a youth worker, and it was back in, I think this was back in 2002, 2003. And I was doing some partnership work with this lady. And we had many, many debates, me and this particular lady, and she could not accept, she could not accept that I was black. She wouldn't acknowledge the word, and she told me she wouldn't call me it. And I couldn't understand why. And we had many debates about this at the time. And I, you know, no matter how I said it, she just said, but you're not black, you're brown, you're brown, you're brown. And I had to explain to her on numerous occasions that, yes, I was a person of colour, but I was happy to be defined as black. And she says, but you're not black. And, you know, at times, you know, I understood it was her view, but there were times when she would make these comments and it wasn't appropriate, or it was in front of young people that we're working with, and other young people of colour who felt offended by this. And it took, you know, I had to get really, I can be quite assertive at times, and I had to get very assertive. And in the end, the only thing that worked for her to understand that I was happy with my blackness and being defined as black was me having to pick up a piece of A4 white paper and saying to her, this is an A4 white piece of paper. You are acknowledged as white, but you do not look like this piece of paper. And it took, you know, it sounds, you know, can make a, you know, can, in hindsight, you know, you can laugh about that a little bit at the time, but it took me to do that to make her understand that just because I didn't look like the colour of my jumper per se, that didn't mean I didn't identify with my race and my blackness, you know. And that was one of the occasions that really made me realise that even working with young people and some of the views that I were hearing my colleagues say towards young people, even then I knew there were many issues going on, and that's why I was so forward thinking in terms of the work I wanted to do and the work I wanted to do in terms of sharing the knowledge about my blackness and about the rights of equality and diversity and inclusiveness for all. And that's why it was really important for me to progress in that work. Then I left that particular role, and I went into a job which was a position as a manager, team leading quite a big staff team who were working with young people 16 to 19 who were not in employment, education or training at that time. And that's when it was my first, I would say, horrendous experience of real, what I would say, direct racism. I was managing a team of young adults who were, some of them were much older than me, which is absolutely fine. You know, I worked really hard, secured my position, and it was okay for the first couple of months. And I realised the more I grew into the role, the racism was actually direct. These silences when you would walk into the room, the black jokes that were done like under the radar. And I did report these incidences. I reported them, and to be honest, nothing was done. I was told I was being highly oversensitive. I was told it was the guys just being the guys. You know, it was not just, you know, it wasn't my blackness, it was also my sexuality. And what, you know, as I put it, I was a big girl then, I could take this, not that I could take it, but that's how I felt at the time. But they were also doing it to some of the BAME students that I had, and that wasn't acceptable, to the point where they were riling the students up to the point of aggression, and then expected me to kick them off the programs that they were on because of their said aggression, which obviously I wouldn't do, because it was other staff, both of colour and white staff, who reported what particular staff were doing. And yet I wasn't supported. And I don't want to go into all the details of what happened at that time, but what I will say quickly is, you know something's wrong when you're driving to work. And I'd been in this job for like nearly at this point, been in this job for 18 months to 2 years. So it's a long time to be dealing with this. But I really liked my job, even with all that going on. But you know when something's changing for you, because it gets to the point when you're driving to work in the mornings and you're in tears, and you don't know why you're in tears. And that's when you know that something has to give. And one morning, another incident happened, and it really undermined me to the point that I sat at my desk and I walked back into my manager's office and I said, I'm going. And she went, oh, you're going for lunch? I said, no, I'm going. and I'm not coming back. And that's not me. I am very professional in conduct, but I knew I couldn't take it anymore. And I also knew I had to look after what I would consider to be my health and well-being. And that meant I either stay in this position or I leave, because I think I was, if I'm being very honest, I was heading for a breakdown, and I needed to maintain my mental health more so than the job. And I walked out of that job not knowing how I was going to pay my bills, how I was going to pay my mortgage. And, you know, thank God I've got a good family around me, and I was able to get into another position at that time. And that's actually what got me into family work, because I'd already been working for quite some time, and the rest is history. And, you know, I have, you know, been quite fortunate. I've had very good experiences since then. I'm not saying I haven't had other issues, but I'm older now and wiser now. I grew a lot in that job, even though it was quite traumatic for me. And I was able to know what I'm willing to accept, what's acceptable, and what's no longer considered appropriate. Just want to say, in terms of systematic racism, does it still exist? Unfortunately, yes. I understand about, you know, the need for processes, but there's a real danger. We do a lot of talking, which I'm talking now, obviously, but what I'm proud to say is what I'm beginning to see is the actions that, you know, the fruit is really beginning to bear. And that's why I think, although I think systemic racism is still quite entrenched, I think with what's happening this year, particularly the murder of George Floyd, I think the narrative has changed. I think the conversation has changed. And I also think more people are willing to have the conversation, are willing to be more open. And I've, you know, this year has, you know, working from home has made me think a lot about what I've seen on the news and the telly over the last couple of months and all the things that happened. But it has given me a renewed faith that, you know, we can make positive changes. We can do it collectively. It isn't a black problem for people of the BAME community to solve. It is a problem. It isn't everybody's problem. It isn't one person's problem. It isn't one community's problem. What I want to quickly go on to, and I'm conscious of time, is I just want to mention I am looking at doing some research at the moment on unconscious bias, and the reason why this is important to me, I understand that we as a uni deliver unconscious bias training, and I think that's a good thing, but I don't necessarily think it works in its own right. I think unconscious bias is great, but what happens when we've done that training? We argue, we say we make people conscious. How long do people stay conscious for? Do they revert back? Does it give them a license to then say, oh, I've lost my consciousness? So I'm proposing to look at unconscious bias training, but then look at progressive training and also maybe anti-racism training, because I think once we make people what we call conscious, what is it we do to make sure they remain in that moment and become what I call progressive thinkers? So that's the piece of work I'm planning to do over the next year. I want to end this. I know we've talked about quite a lot of things and our experiences, but the thing I want to end it on, I still think it's important to talk about the positives. One of the things I'm doing as the inclusion lead for my school is a newsletter. Now, I'm quite proud of this. I haven't actually released it yet, but I have the final copy here in front of me. So I'm quite proud of this. And I will be sending this out sometime on probably tomorrow or Friday. But the only thing I want to do to give you some final, you know, some sentiment on this is I just want to read to you quickly a poem. It's only going to take about 30 seconds. A poem that I wrote only a couple of weeks ago, because it really made me think. And I really want you to see how I see things from my perception through my eyes as a black woman, because unfortunately, I am still having to fight and combat what I call the stereotype. So I'll read this, and this is called This Black Woman. I am tired of my hair being touched without my consent, of being perceived as aggressive when I am assertive, of filling the tick box to pacify the masses, of being stereotyped, of being labelled coloured, black, Afro-Caribbean, ethnic minority, black minority ethnic, and now it's BAME. What's next? Of being undervalued, of not being seen as equal, of having to work twice as hard to achieve success, of not being given the promotion when it was due, of leaving a part of me at the work door, of trying to fit in, of having to make others feel comfortable about my inequality. But most of all, I am tired of not being able to just be me. Thank you. And that's all I really wanted to say today, but thank you.
Thank you, Dawn. And thank you for sharing such a personal reflection of your family and how that shaped you, and for sharing your early career experiences that have shaped your professional journey and clearly you as a person. And just picking up the importance of unconscious bias, we know that unchecked, it has a profound impact on people's opportunities. And it'd be great to hear much more about your research as it progresses. And finally, thank you very much for your really powerful poem on the end on which you finished. That was really great. So that is the end of our speakers, and we now move to the session on questions. And I know that you've all been keeping Jill busy during the session, posting questions, of which I'm now being given copies. So to start off with, if I can welcome back my fellow colleagues into the room. And we start off with the first question. So a number of panelists have mentioned the Race Equality Charter, Mark. Is this enough to deal with the challenges we have in terms of race inequality and racism? And Tyrone, do you want to start?
Thank you, Ian. Yeah, it's a good question. The short answer to that is no. It's not enough. The Race Equality Charter is a framework. I mentioned that in my talk. It just provides us with some key objectives, a timeline, a framework with which to operate in. But ultimately, it's got to work alongside other initiatives. It can't become a tick box exercise. It needs to drive real cultural and behavioural change within our institution, and it's got to form a series of other dialogues that happen in parallel. So that's looking at things like recruitment and retention, looking at the attainment gap between our white and BAME students, and it's also got to have implications on how we resource the different activities that go on campus and off campus. So yeah, the answer to that is it's no, it's not enough just to have the rec. We've got to be doing other stuff alongside that, and that's got to happen in the university and outside of the university as well, because as we know, the life doesn't end when we step off of the campus.
Thank you, Tyrone. I saw a number of nods going on as you were talking there. I'm not sure if anybody wants to come in and either build upon what you've been covering or indeed offer an alternative view.
Slightly. I think the Race Equality Charter is an important goal to achieve, and without it, where would we be? These dialogues are important. I think there's a need for cultural change, and having a motivation such as a Race Equality Charter strategically can create that and help it to move forward. Objectives are important, so we know what we're aiming for, but then it's about delivering those objectives. So although Race Equality Charters are about, and applications are about, it's about what happens to them afterwards. You know, do people just get the bronze and are happy with it? Do they go for the next award, which is silver? Or does it just get parked up, then nothing happens with the action plan itself? And that is a concern. So I think dissemination is important. So what is it that we're doing that needs to be disseminated to staff? And staff within the universities need to take an interest, because I think I've found that often, you know, there's a variance in terms of how many staff are interested in learning about race equality, and others might just turn a blind eye and say I'm too busy for that. And that needs to be addressed, I think, in higher education. And these narratives are important. I mean, the experiences of Tyrone and Dawn, these are important narratives to show how serious the problem is, you know, that people's journeys are not just, you know, they haven't just got positions, they've had a really difficult journey, you know, there's been hurdles, it's been harder to get promotion, it's been harder to achieve, there's been multiple barriers. And I think senior management commitment is really important as well. So yes, we have it in terms of getting the award and achieving that, but who continues it on? And I think sort of personal accountability for that and championing that sort of delivery of it is important too.
Just to come back in, Ian, what I felt it has done, it's enabled us to begin to have those conversations. It really has been a huge catalyst for change. The question was, is it enough? The answer is still, for me, no. But we now need to take those conversations and turn them into real actions, because we now have got momentum with that. It's brilliant that we've gone through that exercise, because it really has encouraged the dialogue, and it's now we're now beginning to get over that fear of talking about race. And it's when we get to the point where we can start to just talk about our experiences and not be judged and not be worried about how it's going to place us. We're heading in the right direction, and those conversations have got to continue.
I just want to add a couple of lines very quickly, just to say I think the key word we're missing here is momentum. That is the thing that has come about in this year, that I have seen more in this year. You know, I've been talking about this type of work for 20 years now, and I have seen more momentum due to someone's knee on a man's neck, unfortunately. And that has just pushed momentum in a way that I couldn't have imagined before that. I will say, yes, the race equality is a framework, and yes, it allows us to have a narrative now. But what I want to see, and I'm beginning to see, is what used to be what I called uncomfortable conversations now becoming comfortable to be spoken freely. And I think that's where the race equality, and it does a lot of things, and we need to see actions, objectives, and not just talk, like I said. But I do see a momentum that I know within my school, they've got me, I'm going to drive it forward regardless. Thank you.
That's helpful. And I think it was interesting that I think the way we've all started to answer that question is actually from a staffing perspective and as the employer. But of course, there's other lenses to look through, if you like, as well, because of course there's the student profile and what it can do, and how it can be a positive force for change with our student body. But also, I think one of my colleagues, you touched upon the importance of us in the locality and in the region as a civic university. And I just wondered if you've got views about, well, actually, how can what we've started on the Race Equality Charter, Mark, and the broader work that we're doing, how can we use that as a positive force for change, both in the student body and more widely?
I think, if I can come in again, Ian, this is something that we've all got to own. It's not just a staff or a student thing. It's a community thing. We are particularly if we're talking about the institution, we are a community, and it can't be seen as different sets of individuals within that. It's got to be something that we all sign up to and we all take on board as being something that we do together. And also, go on. Sorry, Dawn.
No, sorry. I was going to add to what Tyrone just said. You know, you mentioned about talking about it being like a student experience, but I also want to focus more so on the community experience, because I think my concern is we're an institution, and I think we get a lot of people looking in and thinking that's not for me. People don't walk through our campus, for example, because they don't think they can actually walk through our campus. And I think, I'm not saying we don't do stuff in the community, but I think we need to do more work about taking our messages into the community. I mean, that's my background. We didn't wait for something to happen. We took the journey to them. And I think that's maybe something we need to do. I'm not saying we don't do it, but I think we need to do more of it. You know, I live in Birmingham. I drive to Stoke every day, and yet I don't know Stoke. I don't know where the Black community is in Stoke. I don't know where the Asian communities are. I don't know generically what the communities and the makeup of that community, and how I can work better to get those people coming into, not only come in and receive academic formal education, but just to come in and be advocates and have a voice within our university. And I just think that's something we need to look at more. That's just from my perspective. Thank you.
And we've had a number of questions now coming through, and a couple of them are around the same theme. So I'm going to sort of stick with a theme for a moment, if you indulge me. So one of the first questions was, does the panel see a role for mentorship to support BAME colleagues?
I have seen that work in other organisations where BAME staff sort of mentor senior management in terms of their knowledge and the experiences, and it works quite effective. You know, it is effective because there's a lot to learn from these experiences, and we can't just do it in an hour and a half. But so effectively, the BAME staff network mentor senior management to get them to understand the difficulties and bring about change.
The difficulty that I have with that is that we tend to default to the person who's the race person. So yeah. Any questions that we get, any difficult situations that we find ourselves in, a bit like the health and safety advisor, or a bit like the inclusion and diversity head, it seems to be their responsibility, when really it's all our responsibility. And we just need to be careful if we are going down that route of mentor, that they do not become the person that everyone goes to for the answers to all of the questions.
And Tyrone, I think that beautifully comes on to one of the other questions that's been posted, because that being said then, in response to the last question, well, how can white people be better allies?
Demonstrate a commitment to the race equality. So we talked about sort of dissemination, and I think that needs to be at departmental level. So often things are being done at university level, but it's not being cascaded. So at departmental level, there needs to be a commitment, and it's not enough to say we've got X amount of professors at a university. It's about looking at what's going on within units, really, and looking at experiences, looking at, you know, that kind of thing. So I think breaking it down a little bit more, and that's less tokenistic as well. I think, you know, really caring about what's happening.
Can I just add, what I think as well is, just for us to become better allies, is not presuming that because we are BAME, we have all the answers. And the answers have to come collectively, because things can only change if the answers come from everybody. And yes, I'm happy to talk about issues, but I am not the problem solver of all. And that is something that there's a real tendency to think we have all the answers, and actually, no, we don't. So that's something that would help to improve our allyship with one another.
I can understand what. Sorry, go ahead, Haj.
Thank you, Tyrone. I have a tendency to interrupt you. Sorry. So just in terms of, in terms of allies, I think it's quite important that we acknowledge that it's not like we don't go to white people. You know, it's not like we haven't got allies already. I can identify quite a few people within the university and in other roles that I know would take race really seriously, and they're white. You know, so we don't want to us and them. We're already allies. It's about whether white colleagues will take on board our distress and experiences and validate them, really. And it's not the people that are doing that, it's the people that aren't doing that and using language to disguise racism that we've got a problem with. Yeah,
I was just going to add about it's not about they need to do something that they're not doing already. It's just about being able to understand that we have a different experience, and you know, our lived experiences are different completely. We have concerns around privilege, and particularly with white fragility, when you start to have a conversation around race, and then we have to start to navigate round the issues because we don't want to offend, when really it's about just being open and understanding that through our perspective things can be different. Whenever you walk into a room, you walk into a supermarket, getting on the bus, in everyday life, it's different. And I think there just needs to be an acceptance that there is that difference in experience.
And just picking up on that, Tyrone, because it relates to a comment made in the chat bar. The comment from someone in the audience was, was really around extrinsic motivation, because how do we get people to champion improvements in the lives of people with whom they don't share a cultural or ethnic background? How do we overcome that? What is the motivation?
We live in a society, Ian. We work together. We live cheek by jowl. We are part of a society. Black and ethnic minorities are not going away anytime soon. So it's about how do we live together. And I would prefer to live where we understand who we are. We're not afraid to talk about who we are, and we include others in discussions, in our work, in our social circles. I can understand the question there, because there will be some people that perhaps don't have any friends of colour, don't work with anybody of colour, so they're thinking, how does this relate to me? But just go back to what I said at the beginning. You know, this is a nation that's made up of different cultures and different nationalities that have come here to live and make it their home. So it's all of our responsibility to get along with each other.
And I think just adding to that, really, I agree. And you know, we need to develop staff that are culturally competent, don't we? You know, as a business, you don't want to present yourselves as, you know, people that haven't got culturally competent staff, even if they've only got one black student. So that should be built into job descriptions. That should be, you know, that's not, you know, ignorance is not an excuse, is what I'm trying to say. It needs to be part of your development. It needs to be, you know, really robust and built into performance management, all that kind of stuff. I think it's just simply not enough to say, not in my backyard. You know.
And Harsh, you mentioned earlier, I think you made a passing comment about it's not about the number of professors that you have within an institution. And one of the questions that's come in is actually around quotas for boards, and what your views are as a panel on having diversity quotas for boards, committees, appointment panels, and I guess sort of formal structures like that.
So do you mean quotas of an X amount of black people would do that? I don't think there was a need, but because we've had this problem for such a long time now where we haven't achieved representation in the true form, I think there's a case for it. In fact, I think Birmingham City Council were advertising, we have written some newspaper article the other day about bringing back positive action to encourage black people to apply for jobs because of this very problem. So I think we might need to do a bit of a U-turn in relation to that. And I know it's been argued, we've argued against it in the past probably, and it shouldn't be token, but because there is smaller numbers, initiatives like that might be helpful in terms of increasing numbers. But then it needs continued, because what happens is whilst there's an initiative in place, you might get an uptake of higher numbers, but suddenly 2 years later we go back to the norm and the numbers start dropping again. So it seems almost like a statistical game really, rather than true change, and that's what needs to be altered.
Yeah, I agree. It shouldn't be tokenistic, but at the same time, as part of our ambitions to combat structural racism, we need to ensure that people of colour have the opportunity to get into the higher positions in organisations, to make key decisions, or at least to advise and to guide boards and an executive on those decisions which will affect them. And that is one of the key issues around structural racism. It's about the people in power ultimately are still not like us. They're usually white, male, middle class, and they are the ones that are still making the decisions that affect everybody.
And another sort of quite specific HE questions come through. And it's really asking the panel what they think around some of the phraseology that exists around the race equality agenda. So, for example, things like the BAME attainment gap, how do you feel about whether that reinforces a deficit model for students of colour? And how, and if you do, how would you rephrase that? How would you like that described? Or indeed, do we need to tackle it just in a completely different way?
So we talked about in the slides about the BAME attainment gap. I think my personal view is it needs to be there. The language needs to be used to show that there's a gap, because if we take that away or play around with it, then it's not really representative. Yes, it might create a self-fulfilling prophecy, all that kind of stuff, but that is not for the victim, which are often the people, you know, the BAME students to take the brunt on. That is for the perpetrators of racism to change. So, you know, I don't think that needs changing personally, because it needs to be identified, and I think there's been years of work using that phraseology in research and policy and putting it in place.
I think I agree with you, Haj, because I mean, I can understand why people question terminology, and there are some terminologies that have just been around the houses quite a long time. But like you said, the reality is, you know, there is a gap, and I know we're trying to address that. And I know a lot of work is being, but we also know that gap really hasn't reduced in the time that it should have done. So unfortunately, I do think that title is here for the foreseeable future.
And a question came in, and I think it was probably on the back of the first question when we were talking about the Race Equality Charter, Mark, and thinking about it through the different lens of staff, students, and the community. And there was a particular question about, it was great what we said, but actually, how do we really get the students involved in those conversations and that dialogue in a meaningful way?
I believe that's. Go ahead, Tyrone, your turn.
My turn this time. We often have that dialogue through the student union, and as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, it was in fact the previous vice president of the student union that kick-started the BAME network at Staffordshire University. So we're having that dialogue. It needs to gain momentum, but we need to ensure that the students are part of the conversation. And I think it kind of segues back to an earlier question about which groups of people do we need to get, you know, to get involved in this. But I think within the inclusion and diversity groups that we've got at the university, the students do have a voice on that as well. And I think they've got some of their own groups going, where we kind of dip into those as well. So it is a two-way thing.
And from other perspectives within the university, in terms of how you think the students either are getting engaged or we could do more to get engaged with them?
I think it goes back to visual leadership, first of all. You know, if they're not seeing Black people in higher positions, they're not going to speak up, are they? You know, they're just going to, it's going to silence them. So I think visually there's that, addressing that gap again about staffing, and we keep going back to that for a reason. If we're going back to something, it must be for a reason. So we're going back to that for a reason, because visually we need, you know, BAME staff in those positions so that students can speak up. And the research will say students are more likely to speak up and get engaged with committees and so forth where they see that visual leadership. So I think it needs to start there, really. And then the other thing is about involving groups, you know, involving students in student reps. A lot of Black students won't get involved as student reps, so sort of changing that culture of things. And I assume, I wasn't here, I wasn't working for the university at the time, but I assume that there's been some consultation and surveys done as part of the Race Equality Charter with students, sorry, I'm losing my voice, with students around equality and a series of recommendations that we now need to implement and kind of continue the momentum from the findings of that too.
I mean, just to add to that about representation, I agree. And just going back to what Tyrone talked about in terms of education, I didn't actually see a teacher and a trainee teacher as a Black teacher until I was maybe 19 years old. And even at that age, did I ever comprehend the idea of going into teaching myself or becoming an academic. it just wasn't on, it wasn't in my mind because it had never been presented to me. And I'm going to be honest, when I finished school, I was told, why don't you go and work in boots? So when you get those type of responses at 16, it doesn't give you the vision or the drive to think these positions are available. So I think we have to do the representation side, because one of the things I push with all my students regardless of colour is that you can do what I'm doing. So, you know, I've always said it to me and Haj, you know, the BAME staff in our school, and there's not enough of us in terms of representation for other people to see what we do. So at least my students see me and they see me do it. And I have BAME students who have gone off and doing great things now and have thanked me for coming on, and, you know, and things, but there needs to be so much more of that.
Thank you, Dawn. So colleagues on the panel, we've certainly put you through your paces during that period of time. One final question, and again, this has come through on the chat bar. So if you had one message for your school or service that you work within, what should it be to improve things? What would you do? What's that practical step that you'd want to put in place?
From my point of view, one senior manager, a dean, that commits to race equality and takes a pledge to deliver the race equality scheme and work towards a silver award.
Thank you, Harsh. Tyrone and Dawn.
I'd like to see a bit more work done around the decolonisation of our curriculum. There's a lot of work that's being done across the sector with this, and you talked about student involvement earlier, and I think at other institutions, students are very active with being the driving force in those changes, and I think that's something that's being done in some departments, not across the board, and we can't let it just be around student pressure. It's got to be, the change has got to be driven through a multitude of perspectives. And I just looked at some interesting statistics around the number of universities that actually pledged and signed up to decolonisation of the curriculum through active change, and it's 24 out of 128 universities. So that says a lot about the distance we've got to travel in terms of being a sort of a driving force for change, because as we all know, and I've talked about it, and I think everybody here on the panel has talked about the importance of education in the forming of our society. You know, it's cultural, it's behavioural, it's educational, it flows through from policy, and it's all interlinked. We've got to make those changes at institution level for it to begin to gain traction.
Thank you, Tyrone.
I think we need to have what I call more safe spaces where people feel comfortable to have these conversations. Because it's all right saying we want everybody to talk about it, and yes, I'm very proud that we now have the narrative, but I still think there has to be places that people feel comfortable to have the conversations. And the other thing is, I think, is as well, we all know which people will jump on board and say, I think what you're doing is great, I'll support. But we also know there's a lot of colleagues who never jump on, and that might not because they don't want to. It might simply be they're not comfortable, they don't know how to start or where to go from. So I think it's about having that safe space, the same way like when I run a session with students and we have controversial topics and I play devil's advocate so that we can get them to say things, so we can change their opinions or challenge their views so they don't take them into the workplace or practice. I think we need to be able to, as adult lecturers or academia or community, be able to have those conversations safely in a safe forum. So I think safe spaces need to be looked at.
Great, thank you very much. So some great insights there, and actually some great challenges for us as an organisation as well to progress with. So thank you very much, panel, and indeed the audience for this evening. I can't believe how quickly the time has gone during both the presentations and the question and answer session. So a big thank you particularly to the panel this evening. I think what's happened is we've really cemented the context for the work that we're doing on the Race Equality Charter Mark and touched a wide range of issues that all of us need to work together on locally, but also across our staff and our student community. But also I think there's something about how we work as part of the higher education sector as well, being clear about our values, but making sure that actually the commitments we've made in the Race Equality Charter Mark application, we actually do go forth and actually deliver, and not just deliver them in that tick box exercise approach, which was reflected on earlier, but to actually have a really deep impact upon the culture and the working practices of the organisation. So a big thank you to everybody for being part of tonight's event, for sending in so many questions during the question and answer session, and for putting myself and the panel through their paces. So a final reminder that the links for the recording of this event will be circulated after tonight, and please look out for information in the future about different conversations we'll be having. Thank you very much and good night.